the term sensory integration, but it's used interchangeably with sensory processing. So sometimes I'll say sensory processing, sometimes sensory integration. They're the same thing. But Jean Ayres is the occupational therapist that in the 60s, what happened was that she was working with children with cerebral palsy. And she found that even when she would address their problems concerning their posture, their stability in their joints and strengthening and stretching, they still didn't seem to know. When she would ask them to raise their arm, they would raise their leg, things like that. They didn't seem to know where their body was in relationship to the world and where their body was in space. So she said, there's something else going on here. So she started researching through the UCLA Brain Research Institute, and to eliminate other factors in cerebral palsy, what she did was she got children who were typical in every other way, but had poor coordination, and she started researching this thing that she coined the term sensory integration. What is sensory integration? Sort of hard to explain, I'm sure you know, but it is the organization of sensation coming in. When we experience sensation, we are not always conscious about it. We hear things, we hear things that we don't attend to. We feel things that we're not conscious about. But our brain is taking in this information. It's organizing it, making it meaningful, so we're able to adapt to our environment. This is going on, again, without our knowledge. It's just subconscious. So when you're walking and you're going down an incline, you automatically shift your weight. You can be talking to someone, you're not paying attention, but you shift your weight so you don't lose your balance as you go down go up the incline. And if you have to step over a rock while you're doing it, you just automatically do it. And this is where people who have sensory integration problems fall short, where they don't have the coordination and they don't have that automatic response to their environment because they just don't know where their body is in space. The three main sensations responsible for sensory integration, one of them is the vestibular system. This is in your inner ear, and it's responsible for your ability to balance. So let's say you close your eyes and I flip you upside down. You know you're upside down. You can feel it. That's what your vestibular system is for understanding balance, understanding where you're centered or whether you're not centered, your total body positioning. The tactile system, that's what we're more familiar with, the touch. And so it's your ability to tell whether something feels soft, hard, rough, smooth, cold, wet, does it hurt? That's the tactile system. The proprioceptive system, this is in your joints. This is where if you close your eyes and I raise your arm, even though you didn't raise it, if I raise your arm for you, you would know it was lifted. You would know exactly where it is. If I bent your wrist with your eyes closed, you would know it's bent. That's what proprioception is. It's your joint positions. So sensory processing disorder is a condition that exists when sensory signals don't get organized into appropriate responses. We're taking in this information. We're taking in where my body is in space generally. We're taking in where my joints are in space. We're taking in whether I'm feeling cold or hot or sitting in a hard chair or a soft chair. Our brain's taking in all that information without us being cognizant of it, without us realizing it. It's taking in that information and it's making it meaningful for us. So we know when to shift our weight when we're sitting in an uncomfortable chair or things like that. When it's not working, what you see in the child or the adult that has sensory processing disorder, they tend to be clumsy. Often they have behavior problems. I find a lot more behavior problems from SPD when it's a boy because athletics has so much to do with their social skills that it seems to affect them more socially and to be uncoordinated. Anxiety, depression, it'll affect their performance in school, and if it's not treated effectively. There are two main categories when I look at a child with sensory processing disorder. I'm first wondering if they're a sensory modulation issue or if they have a sensory registration issue. I'm going to talk about both. We're going to start with sensory modulation. This is when an individual over-responds. Most of the time they over-respond to their sensation. So they get car sick, they can't stand movements, they can't stand certain textures, they can't stand certain sounds, smells. They can't, they're always overreacting to sensory input. Or what happens to these individuals is sometimes the brain is so overwhelmed and so overreacting to that input that they start to shut everything out. And so in response to being a sensory modulation problem, in response to being overreactive, they start to underreact as a means of protecting themselves. So the child who has sensory modulation either is overreactive all the time, or they fluctuate between being overreactive and underreactive. Often these kids are very hyperkinetic. They're always running, they're always moving. They can be disruptive in a classroom because they can't ignore anything. They'll, something going out in the hallway is distracting to them. Everything, they have to attend to and react to everything. The treatment for modulation to calm the central nervous system, what we need to do is do total body heavy work. So it tends to be activities. Heavy work is, the definition of heavy work is working body weight against gravity or more. So that's how much pressure you need. So, and I'll show you examples of what I mean by that. But it's a total body, and it's mostly like giving lots of pressure and giving lots of heavy effort on their part physically in the activities. For example, this is just a recreational example, but going tubing in a river, the child with the stick had to push hard on the rocks to avoid the rock. So she had to see the rock coming. She pushed the rock. She had to push in the right direction and the right, position to be able to get around the rock. So there's also motor planning, which I'll talk more later about. But there's also motor planning involved. But this is a total body experience. She's sitting in a position where she has to keep, while she's going over the wave, she has to keep her posture up, even though she's being thrown back. So she's working against gravity. And so that's, one of those great activities, recreational activities that address it. This is what you might see in therapy, where we'll put them on a weight bearing on their arms, where they're taking their body weight in through their arms and in a prone position, face down. He also has to lift his legs off gravity so that they're not uncomfortably, touching the ground, and he has to maintain this position while bearing weight while playing a game. The best way to address these things, you don't have a child just sit there and, okay, now bear weight. You have them do it in the midst of an activity. That's why I like recreational examples, because they don't want to be thinking about what they're doing. They want for the brain to truly process and integrate the sensation. It shouldn't be conscious of it. It should have they should be doing some a goal-oriented activity, such as playing this board game or playing with putty or Play-Doh or doing something else that doesn't allow them to concentrate on the input they're receiving. Plus, they're able to tolerate it more because they're having fun. They're not paying attention to how much work they're doing. Anything in the pool is always great. They're working constantly against resistance when they're moving in the water. Water's always resisting every movement they make. But what I find, and a common error, is if the child is just allowed to doggy paddle in the water. There's not all that much resistance. There's a little bit. It's good, better than nothing. But what I like to see is that you make them swim on top of the water, even if you have to put a floaty under their belly so that they're on the top of the water trying to tread the water. If they're going to get things that you've dropped on the bottom of the pool, picking them up and coming up against the resistance. They have to, the resistance going down to the bottom and then coming back up. You want to incorporate as much resistance as possible. There's another activity you might find in a clinic where they're, on their tummy on the scooter board. He's working again against gravity, lifting his body off the floor so that he can scoot down the ramp and across the room. But he's not just doing that. He's going to get a puzzle piece to go put it in a puzzle, and so he's not thinking about what he's physically doing. He's got a goal. He has rules, but he has a goal in mind while he's doing this. There's another example you might see in a clinic. Something that's very common with all, whether it's sensory modulation or sensory registration, any sensory processing problem, is that they have a tendency to have very, low muscle tone. Muscle tone is the amount of muscle fibers you have active in your muscles at rest. You can think of it like you don't want your arm, for example, to be cold and then suddenly you have to move your arm and you can't move it right away because not enough muscle fibers are already active. Okay, you want to be able to move your arm at the second that you need to move it, even if you're asleep. I sort of think of like when I think of the old, coffee machines. You have to turn them on and wait a while before you can actually make a coffee for it to warm up. You don't want your muscles to work like that. What allows our muscles to work spontaneously and whenever and be ready at any time is called muscle tone. And a lot of our kids don't have it, and it affects their or they don't have a lot of it, enough of it, and so they have a tendency to have poor posture, and they have a tendency. So on top of having the problems of not knowing where their body is in space, they also have maybe weakness in their joints because they don't have a good tight joint that is because that's maintained by muscle tone. And so you'll see in therapy, we're not just addressing the sensory system, but we're also trying to get the muscle tone up, which is done through the vestibular system. You'll see the scooter board activities, all that increases your muscle tone. And then we'll go right into some bearing weight activities, which is good for the proprioception, for the joint awareness, but it's also making all the muscles around the joint contract. And so it's creating stability and strength in their joint. Eventually, the effects of the vestibular system on muscle tone is temporary. So it may raise your muscle tone temporarily, which is good because you get good joint position before you challenge it in a weight-bearing position. But but that will go back down. There's no permanent way to affect your muscle tone. But in therapy, hopefully, we're strengthening the joints. And so by strengthening joints, that helps compensate. So you'll get better coordination, not only from the sensory perspective, but also from the physical perspective of strengthening the joints. So that's what this child is doing here. On top of the fact that she's working on a visual motor drawing, coloring activity as well, and fine motor, she's also working on her pelvic joint and co-activating, getting the strength through her pelvis. And she's also on an unstable surface, so she's getting that vestibular input, the movement of her body. I would never do this to a child all at once. This picture is strictly for teaching because, that would freak the kid out. But I have used all these techniques in the classroom to help children with sensory modulation disorders. So I'm just going to show you all the different techniques, but I would never do this all at once to one child. If a child is really fidgety and can't stay still and seems to always need input and movement, you can have him put his feet on TheraBand. Do you see his feet have a stretch of TheraBand tied between the two legs of the desk, and he puts his feet on it, and that way he gets the pressure in through his feet, so hopefully he doesn't have to fidget so much. You can also put in, I don't have this here in the picture, but an inflatable disc or a wedge you may have seen, and they can sit on that, and that's another way of getting that vestibular input and the proprioceptive input to get them to be able to not need to move around so much and to be able to sit still. This child also has a weighted vest on. They're very effective. They help kids focus, help calm the central nervous system so that they are able to attend better. This child also has an inclined writing surface that helps his posture, since they have a tendency to have low muscle tone and therefore poor posture. And Sassy says she loves the idea of the TheraBand at the feet. I love it because it's not very obvious. Sometimes I'll give it to other kids in the classroom just so that the child doesn't stand out. And it's, it's cheap, it's easy. So yeah, I find it very effective and easy to implement in any classroom. I also have him on an inclined writing surface so that way his posture is better. It also improves their visual motor skills, which I'll get into later more, because it's easier to copy from a vertical surface such as the chalkboard onto a semi-vertical surface onto their paper. So if the paper is slightly inclined, it helps their visual motor skills. But in addition, it helps their posture. And in this case, this child is writing, some therapists use, and I've used them, weights on the hands for a better awareness of where their hand is in space. They are more to be able to apply more pressure because they can't gauge their pressure. They don't have that sensation, so they might press too hard or too light. But another way to do it, I find I like using, is a vibrating pen. And so that's a pen that vibrates. I get them online. Unfortunately, I haven't found them out in the stores. They used to sell them all the time at Toys R Us and things like that. But now I get them online. And basically it's vibrating. And vibration has a normalizing effect on muscle tone and also on your awareness. I mean, when you work with a vibrating pen, when you let it go, you still feel your hand. You're very aware of your hand. So it's very effective that way of making them more aware of their hand. And they have to control it more because it's moving. And so they tend to apply a little more pressure and a little more control when they use a vibrating pen. This is just another activity I played with kids. The more it's a game type thing, the easier it is to motivate them. It is a crab soccer, and I have them as sort of a modified back bend in a way. Their hands are behind them. They're lifting their tushkis off the floor, and they're on their feet, and they kick a ball to me, and I kick it back to them, or I have children play together. And it's just another way of bearing weight, again, to give that heavy work sensation so that we can calm the central nervous system. Now we'll talk about sensory registration. These are kids who are just under-responsive. They're the quiet ones in the class. They're the ones who unfortunately often I always worry about them in the classroom because they have a tendency to be the wallpaper, they're just sort of quiet. And when you have a classroom of kids who may be in the modulation spectrum, part of the sensory integration, they're getting all the attention. They're the squeaky wheel. So we got to, I always worry about the registration kid who's quiet, but he may not be learning a thing in the classroom because because he's quiet doesn't mean he's compliant. He's not necessarily attending. He's not necessarily learning. So these are the kids that also have, since they don't process touch well, they don't feel it when, they don't, this is like, for example, I have a child who I spin and spin and spin, and she never gets dizzy. Um, uh, or they tend to be unsafe, because they haven't learned through pain. They don't experience pain like you and I do. So they have a tendency to have poor safety awareness. And, they go and they hurt themselves, and they just they react very little, or certainly not as much as you expected them to do. And so that's this kind of child. Their treatment involves stimulation. There's a common mistake that believing that if a child, for example, has tactile defensiveness, that you treat it by bombarding them with tactile stimulation. Okay, the child hates to be touched. He hates, tactile defensiveness is that they hate to be touched. They hate to be, they hate certain textures. They hate the tags on their shirts. They hate to brush their hair, whatever. And so a lot of people mistakenly, even therapists mistakenly, because they really don't get into this that enough in school, and they mistakenly will think, okay, what we have to do is make them tolerate it. And so they go in there and they put them on race buckets, and they put them in sand, or they suggest that to the parents. You'll only teach them to tolerate pain. You will not decrease the tactile defensiveness. Tactile defensiveness needs to be treated with heavy work, like the modulation kits. Sensory registration is where we use the stimulation, the sand, and the sensory experiences, and the multi sensory type input. You want to get their sensory system more reactive, so you stimulate. A recreational activity, well, really, gotta be honest, with horseback riding, I do it with all kids. It has just this normalizing effect on all kinds of sensory input, but it's a good example of how that vestibular input that they're getting while they're on the horse is very stimulating. And I've had kids who have never talked before do hippotherapy and said hi to mom for the first time while on the horse. I mean, it's really an incredible technique. This is called Learning Breakthrough. This little boy, it was not developed for sensory integration, but I saw the potential for it. It was actually developed by a neurologist whose son is dyslexic, and whose son is an adult now. This has been around for a while, but he was dyslexic, and this neurologist studied that found that there are 7 places in the brain. There's 7 centers in the brain that are responsible for reading. And he claims that this program, where if you see the boy is standing on a tilt board, the tilt board can be adjusted to different angles. It's a really cool tilt board. And he's looking at a DVD player, and he's being told what to do to that ball that's hanging from, I don't know if you guys can see my arrows, but it's hanging from the ceiling. There's a ball, and as it swings towards him, he has to hit it with his knuckles, he has to hit it with his elbows, he has to hit it with his forehead, he has to hit it twice, 3, and then there's other things. There's a bar that he has to hit it with, and stuff like that. So, but I see it as a great sensory activity and sensory program. I use it for that, and couldn't tell you if it helped their reading. I never really heard from the parents about, oh, now he's reading so much better, but definitely it's a great sensory input, because he's both on a vestibular, he's having to concentrate on a ball that's moving, he has to time his movements to hit the ball, but you can also do something similar at home with what do you call that? This just occurred to me, so I don't remember what it's called. There's a pole that you can put in your backyard, and you put a, what do you call that? I even have one, and it has like a volleyball at the end. Tetherball, that's right, Sassy, thank you. But that's a great activity, and if you add in that they have to play it sitting on a big, one of those big those big therapy ball type balls, you know, you've got even more input going on. So, but it's a great motor planning activity. Here's another activity I love is being in the sand at the beach, you know, just building sand castles. This is my family. As you can see, they all have tactile defensiveness on their feet. They're all wearing shoes at the beach. So they're not a good example, but you know, but this is great. You take them, we live in South Florida, we should take every advantage of everything we have. So going to the beach is a great sensory activity. This is just another example of, you know, using swings of different kinds. You want the stimulation on swings. A common error is to have them spin. They want to spin, you know, and they spin and spin and spin and spin. Well, that's not going to stimulate. The brain habituates to the input if it's consistent. And so you don't want consistency. You want them to spin one direction, you want them to spin another direction, you want them to go vertically and like a pogo stick, you want them to go horizontally like the scooter boards, you want them to go slow, you want them to go fast, you want to have a multitude of inputs going on in different planes and in different velocities to be effective. Painting, any kind of arts and crafts where they have to get their hands into it. I mean, yeah, these kids are using brushes, but they also use their fingers and putting glitter in the paint and changing the texture. Bathtub time. I mean, we're all busy parents. I mean, I cannot tell you how many times when my daughter started therapy with a new therapist, they would come to me with a big list of things to do because they figure I'm a therapist, so I'll treat her all the time. And I'm like, no, I'm a mom. I have other things to do with her. But it can be just a part of your everyday routine. And in one thing is like bath time. I'll have foams, you know, like that foam soap that's in different colors. I'll put it on the walls of the bathtub tile, you know, and the tile around the bathtub, and they can write their name and they can get all, you know, full of those suds. They can squeeze towels and you can wet the towels and squeeze out the water, and same with sponges and that sort of thing. Here I'm just showing multiple forms of and directions and of use of swings. There's a child way in the back that's on a glider swing, or skyrider they call it, and there's a child up front that's in a prone position, face down, reaching up high, working on her posture control too, because she's working on those back muscles to get them stronger. She's also getting that vestibular input to increase her muscle tone. And the other child that's in a seated position. You know, these are just multiple ways of examples of getting of giving vestibular stimulation. And note that they have goals, like the girl in the front, she's getting bean bags and then she's throwing them into the bucket behind the therapist. Lotion massage, towel massage. I do that with many of my kids. I start out with just lotioning them, and I use the excuse I have to wipe off the extra lotion with the towel, and I rub their hands in the towel, and I really do a deep pressure inputs and going back and forth with, so the towel's on my hands, the child's hand inside the towel, I cover their hands, and I'm even tractioning, pulling their arm. Traction and compression gives proprioceptive input information to the brain as to where that joint is in space. So let's see, and then just working on, you know, these therapy balls easily. Everybody can have them at their homes, and shifting weight left, right, forward, back, going in circles, bouncing up and down. They might even want to sit on it, try it sitting on it during homework time. That might be helpful for them. Just another example, this child's getting magnets off of a metal door and getting on the swing, and he has to drop those magnets into a basket, and I usually will take the basket and walk around the room, so he has to be constantly changing, shifting his direction and his velocity. Now we're going to talk about motor planning. This is a problem or a process that you can find problems in any kind, whether it's sensory modulation, sensory registration. Often they have also motor planning problems. This is the ability for us when typically we look at someone do, say, a jumping jack for the first time. We can get an idea of how to do it. We come up with an idea in our minds, and this is, again, subconscious. You sort of get an idea of what to do, and then your body can sort of plan, okay, my arms have to go up, my legs have to go out, you know, and then you are able to execute it. You might have to practice a few times, like riding a bike, but you have a, you have an idea and you start to just do it. And that's what that requires motor planning, the ability to carry out an unfamiliar motor action. It's very common in sensory processing disorder children and learning disabled kids, and they look uncoordinated. They just look clumsy. They have difficulty figuring out, riding a bike, jumping jacks, kicking a rolling ball. It's very complicated to kick a rolling ball. It's sort of like that ball that was hanging from the ceiling that I was showing you before. It's moving at you while you have to move towards it and meet it at the right angle and with the right amount of force, and the right timing, and you have to sequence your movements to be able to connect with the ball. And so you'll often see that when you roll a ball to someone who has motor planning issues, they will kick the air and the ball will roll behind them, and their leg is still in the air. They kick before the ball gets to them, that sort of thing. The 3 phases of motor planning is ideation, which is coming up with the ideas. You see something new that you've never done before, and you sort of have an idea of what you're going to do. Planning your movements, and then actually executing it. And the breakdown can be anywhere in those 3 phases. Sometimes I have kids who definitely see what they have to do. They have an idea of how to do it. They go over to the bike so they understand what a bike is for. They start to try to get on the bike, and maybe it's their planning. They put their hands on and then they don't know what to do with their legs. Or maybe it's execution. They know how to get their leg up, but then they can't, shift the weight because of their posture control. They can't shift the weight to get onto the seat. It's 3 phases, and the breakdown can be at any 3 of those phases. How we treat it. Well, a lot of the sensory activities I've already discussed is how we treat it, but we add in the component. So in other words, if they're a modulation problem, they're going to get a lot of heavy work. If they're a registration problem, they're going to get a lot of sensory stimulation. And then we're going to do the motor planning, which is usually in the form of obstacle courses, because that's the easiest way to do, to have novel motor patterns, introduced to the child. So I start with, they come up with the idea. So I want to know, what do you want to do in this obstacle course? Do you want to go up the rock wall? Do you want to go down the slide? Do you want to then go on this swing, or jump on the trampoline and then go crab walk across the room to the beanbag and then take a beanbag? They have to come up with the idea of what they want to do. Then they have to plan it and execute it. They have to go through the whole obstacle course and then practice it. It can require, a lot of these motor planning issues affect their timing and this is definitely an example of something that the child has to time. They have to isolate certain movements of their body and keep the rest still. Being able to throw a ball into a basket, walking on a balance beam. This child is walking on a balance beam, picking up pegs, putting them in a pegboard on the other side of the balance beam. So she has to motor plan, how am I going to bend my knees, keep my balance while I grab it. This is, again, another unique activity. He'd never done this before. It's unlikely he would ever be doing this at school. And so he went on his knees. He had to use a racket. That's a ball that's hanging from our zip line. And so it would go flying and come right back, and he had to measure his movements and sequence his movements. This is an example of a child with poor motor planning. And as you can see, he has his racket up high as if the birdie is above him, but the birdie has already passed him and has fallen on the floor. He's way late in trying to connect with that birdie. This is an easy home do-it-yourself activity, but more for a higher functioning kid. But what I do is I take a file, I open it up, and I draw all these lines, and it starts on one line, and this one has 5 different colors, but I draw a little star on the left. I draw a line, it's a blue star with a blue line. I squiggle the line all over the place, and it ends on the other side with another blue star. And so it's a track they have to follow. You put a magnet on the top, or a metal thing on the top, something metal, and below her hand is holding a magnet, and so she sees the metal thing on top, a paper clip on top or something, and she's holding a magnet that's connected to that paperclip through the board or the file. Okay, and then she's following the track. So now she's using her visual perception to make sure she doesn't go off track, that she stays on the right color track, that she doesn't go off onto the other colors. But she's also can't see her hand under the file, and so she can't use her vision to compensate. Where do I move left? Do I move right? She has to just feel her way, and often what happens is that they lose the paperclip. They lose contact with it. So now she has to, try to figure out how to get her hand under the paperclip again. And again, she can't see her hand. So it's just a great motor planning activity that way. Fine motor, all these things are always affected by sensory processing issues. So fine motor coordination, visual, and bimanual coordination. Visual motor integration is very necessary for copying from a book or a vertical surface from their board in the classroom to be able to copy accurately. In hand manipulation, or the muscles of the hand, how I test this is I pick up, sorry, I'm trying to find my camera. You pick up objects from the table and put it in the palm of your hand. And then you pick up another object and put it in the palm of your hand without dropping the others. Those are your extrinsic muscles of your hands. Those are the large muscles of your hands. What's even harder is with your handful of the pennies, for example, you have to take one out and put it into a container. And so without dropping the others, okay? This is your in-hand manipulation, the muscles that are required for in-hand manipulation to be able to manipulate anything within your hand. So, so often our kids don't isolate even their fingers, just touch each finger. They can't even do that much. So imagine when they have to shift their pencil in their hand, or grab an object and be able to shift in their hand, a toy or whatever. I had a mom who took her husband took her children. They are typical children in every other way, but they have sensory processing disorder. And they took them fishing. And she said it was like watching them have claw hands. They couldn't isolate their fingers. They didn't know what to move, what to do. They couldn't, to work the rods and the reels. They just couldn't do it. It was completely frustrating for her husband, because she says they have claw hands. And I thought that was a great description. I mean, I could exactly picture what it's like for them. And let's see, and self-care skills, tying your shoes, brushing your teeth, opening water bottles, manipulating, feeding you, all this, of course, is affected by your fine motor, visual, bimanual coordination skills. So some activities that can be tried is, this is a laminated piece of paper where I glued, I asked a teacher, actually, a teacher's aide, to cut die cuts of letters out of sandpaper. And then I put the paper on top. And since it's dark, they can see it. And then with the extra stimulation from running their pencil over a rough surface, it gives them more input. And so a lot of kids, I got them tracing for the first time on with this sort of input. This is the Handwriting Without Tears program. It's great because you create the letters with wood pieces that it comes with. There's a template you can put them on, and then you write with a chalk on a chalkboard. Unfortunately, we don't have chalkboards in the classrooms anymore, and we've lost something because of that. You can then take a piece of a small piece. I like using a small piece of sponge, but nowadays we have aqua doodle pens, and we can use that as well. But if you have a child who has problems with pincer grip or with tripod, holding the pencil appropriately with 3 fingers, you might want to use the small, just cut a little piece of sponge, and you wet it, and then they trace over it. And let's face it, it's hard to find fun ways to practice their tracing. And so and then when it dries, it leaves a watermark. So it's still more that they can do. They can trace now the watermark and then erase it. And they seem to like it. They love to erase. I don't know what it is about using water on chalkboard, but they seem to love it. And I'll get a big chalkboard and do a whole sentence or do the whole alphabet, and they'll trace that way. This is another thing I made, as you can tell by it's falling apart a little bit. But this is a laminated piece of paper, and I laminated after I had made these grids with different strokes, and a cross, a diagonal line. There's an X. There's a circle, a square, or a diamond, that sort of thing. And then the first 2 columns are outlined with glitter paint, and that way I can and that way they get the idea of not going through, to stay on the stimulus, stay on the target. They don't just go and trace it and just keep going right into the next grid. They get the idea of boundaries. And then the third, you don't see it in this picture, but the third column is without that extra input. And then the last column is just drawing it by themselves. I'm seeing someone wrote, another idea is using the blackboard or even paper and having child type, for example, left side finger placement on keyboard and place pinky as number 1. Used for isolating fingers. Yeah, definitely. That's a great idea. Definitely using the keyboards is going to be very important for our kids. This is just a picture of someone trying to isolate, a child trying to isolate his fingers so he can hold the string to put him through a bead. Weight bearing is very important. So when we're doing weight bearing and it's a sensory kid, we're looking at proprioceptive input, but it's also developing the muscles of their hands, because we first develop the muscle, the arches in our hands. We have 3 arches. This is called the oblique arch. It's the arch that is responsible for us bringing our fingers together. We have this, let me see. Okay, this arch, the longitudinal arch. And we have, I don't know how to show it, but it's like this arch. And so that's the transverse arch. All these arches, on many children, you look at their hands and they look completely flat. There's no muscle tone. There's no muscle tone in there, and it's because they're not using their arches. They're not, and you develop your arches of your hands similarly as you do on your feet through shifting weight. And you do that as an infant when you're crawling. And then if you're crawling and you have a block in your hand, you're shifting weight differently. And all these things develop all the muscles in your hands. So often when a child has fine motor problems, we are doing weight bearing, okay, because we're weight shifting through their hands. We do activities where they're bearing weight, like that little boy that we showed earlier, where he was on his stomach on a wedge, and he was playing that board game. He's doing that for proprioceptive input to know where his body is in space, but he's also shifting his weight over his hands, developing his muscles of his hands. And this is just another sensory activity of isolating finger and drawing and writing with shaving cream up on the mirror. there, back to this, I've even had the children sit, I wish I had the picture here, do it with their feet. They sit in front of the mirror and they put their feet on the mirror with the shaving cream, and they love doing it. They'll shift their feet like that and do a rainbow with the shaving cream, and now they're working on their stomach muscles too, and they're working against gravity, lifting their legs off the ground. So they're getting that total body heavy work against gravity as well. They're bearing weight. Usually they're leaning back onto their hands, so they're bearing weight into their arms, working on their shoulders. It's another good one for home. Other recreational activities are, like I mentioned before, swimming, karate. Depends. It depends on the kid, and it depends on the teachers and how patient they are. But it's good for discipline. It's good that they have mirrors so they can watch their body move, so that they get that extra input if they need it for motor planning while they do those activities. Playing soccer, kayaking, sailing. I had a dad who when I described the issues that his son had with sensory integration and his postural control, he said, "How about sailing?" And I go, "Oh, that would be wonderful," because he had the child would go sailing and he would have to sit on the edge of the boat and he'd have to lean all the way back while pulling the rope, and so he's working on all these muscles, and of course it's costly. So if you can do it, that's wonderful. Rock climbing, motor planning. Where do I put my foot next? And riding bike. Let me see. So anyway, these are some additional resources that you can look up either online or the book or the DVD. A. Jean Ayres, her book. It's pretty old, but still useful. And this network, sinetwork.org, and the Out of Sync Child, the book and DVD. I've always found parents find it useful. Rosie mentioned sometimes mirrors are distracting for kids. Like I said, we have to see what works. Every child is different. Okay. And this is my contact information. Feel free anytime to contact me with questions. Again, before I was ever a therapist, not before I was a therapist, but before anything else, I'm a mom. Before I'm a therapist, before I'm anything else, I'm a mom. So, so if you ever wanted to just brainstorm or whatever, you can feel free to email me or call me. I do service children in their homes and schools in the Broward and Dade County areas. So feel free to contact me through this contact information that I've just posted. Let me see if there's any other information. That sometimes children are motivated by mirrors. Sometimes they just perform better with them. Okay. And OT clinics often have mirrors. So. Okay. Any other questions? Does anyone have any questions for me? Okay, wait. Is there anything you suggest for kids that have oral motor sensitivity? Okay. I'm sorry. So as far as oral motor, sensory modulation issues, being hyper responsive to, Marlene asked me, being hyper responsive to any kind of sensation is a sensory modulation issue, and you treat it the same. It's heavy work. It's this is the kid